Welcome to the Student Success Podcast. I'm Al Solano, founder of the Continuous Learning Institute, or CLI, a higher education online resource focused on providing community college and open access university educators with practical information on how to get results at their campus. As a resource within CLI, the Student Success Podcast is focused on just that, the challenges, opportunities, failures, and successes of practices intended to improve student success and equity. The goal is to leave you with thought-provoking ideas, nuts and bolts information, and or lessons learned from the field so you can consider how you might apply them to your institutional context. For today's podcast, it's a pleasure to have Dr. Melinda Karp. Melinda is a nationally recognized expert on improving students' transitions to college and supporting them once they're there. She founded Phase 2 Advisory after nearly 20 years conducting research and working with colleges on education reform as Assistant Director at the Community College Research Center, Teachers College, Columbia University. The proud granddaughter of refugees, Melinda works with national and institutional leaders, campus-based faculty and staff, and philanthropists to ensure that all individuals have the opportunity to realize the intergenerational mobility higher education provides. She frequently writes, speaks, and comments on education reform at professional meetings, in the media, and in academic forums. Melinda holds a BS in Human Development and Family Studies from Cornell University, and both an MA and a PhD in Sociology and Education from Columbia University. She chairs the Effective Advising Practice Guide panel for the Institute on Education Sciences What Works Clearinghouse, and she is a member of the inaugural editorial team for the Journal of Post-Secondary Student Success. Welcome to the Student Success Podcast, Melinda.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here, Al.
So I'd like to start all podcasts by asking guests if they wouldn't mind sharing something beyond their work, a hobby, a special talent perhaps, or a story they wouldn't mind sharing. Do you have anything you'd like to share?
I did ask my kids. I think I've come to embrace the fact that for a lot of us, parenting is one of our primary identities, and we hide it at work. And I have no filter, so I decided not to. My kids informed me that I have nothing interesting to share. I don't actually believe them. I think, the two things, one, anyone who knows me knows that I am a New Yorker by birth. I grew up in Rochester, as you said, went to Cornell, go Big Red. You and I both were there, I think, at the same time. And then lived in New York City for a very long time when I was at Teachers College. And I now live in Denver, Colorado, which has been a shockingly big culture change in some ways and really informative. The other one is that I'm a runner. I've run 7 marathons, over 20 halves. I am not fast. I'm just stubborn. So I think those are the two things they finally decided were interesting about me.
So let's talk about culture change for a moment. It was a culture shock. So can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, it's really interesting as someone who spent her whole life on the East Coast. You don't feel like you're going somewhere new. It's still the same country. Denver is a city. It's not like we went full rural, although I can see mountains from my house, not big building. And I'm a sociologist. Like I talk about culture all the time, and that culture is this soup that we live in, right? That you don't notice it. And I think if we think about this from a transformation institutional perspective, it's often one of the hardest pieces is that every college, higher ed has a culture and every college has a culture, and we often don't even realize it. And it was really interesting to live that shift. There is something different about being in the Intermountain West than being on the East Coast. And I'm having a very hard time articulating what is different, but it feels different. The diversity is different. That's not to say that Colorado is not a diverse state. It absolutely is, but it's a different kind of diversity. And I don't know how to explain it, but my husband moved out about 10 months before I did with the kids, and he kept saying, it's just really different. I was like, honey, what does that mean? I now know why he couldn't articulate it, because there's something about culture that when you're in it is very hard to define, and yet you feel it. And so I have felt very dislocated. We also moved about 18 months before the pandemic, which I would not recommend because it's really hard to grow roots during a isolating period. But I do think that this idea that we live in a soup that we can't articulate, and it frames how we live our lives and move through the world. We kind of know that in higher ed. but to live it this way has been very interesting. So that was not a great answer because I'm still puzzling it through myself.
Well, it's an honest answer. And I'm sure you've heard this before when college professionals move from one campus to another. And I like that. I like it's a soup.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they struggle too. They're like, it's just different and it's
Mm-hmm.
hard to articulate it. But after a while, they begin to see the nuances and what makes this soup so different from the other soup. But yet, there's still some similarities. There's still some things that are still the same.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things to put it in higher ed is we talk a lot about this when we think about this from an equity perspective, right? That our institutions culturally were grounded for 18-year-old white men. And a lot of our norms grow up from that tradition. And so when we ask our students to move into those institutions, we're asking them to move to a different type of soup. And that sense of dislocation that you can't quite put your finger on, it's real, right? And I can speak now as having moved, like when you feel like you don't belong, it doesn't make you want to stay. Like, I mean, I'm good now in Colorado, but there was a while I was like, I'm not sure I'm cut out for the Intermountain West. I can't get a good bagel here. And it over time, or pizza. Like we go back to New York and all we want are the carbs. But I think there's an analog there for faculty and staff, like you said, when they move from institution to institution, but also for our students, that they go from high school to college or the workplace to college, and on its surface, it's not super different. But there's something different about it. And that sense of dislocation is real. And how do we help them navigate that? And I've been writing about that for 20 years. But to live it changes how changes how you interpret that.
Yeah, I like that you put students into this because it's not only college professionals that move to different soups, but students come from a K-12 soup
Mm-hmm.
into a higher ed soup. But sometimes, especially for reentry students, they went out and did other things. So that's another soup altogether. And then
Exactly.
exactly. And we'll see about bringing back the marathon piece because I do want to learn more. But I'm always fascinated by people who can run that far because I felt that being healthy is really important. I've tried to be fit all my life, but I could never run.
You have to really like yourself. You spend a lot of time with yourself.
Yeah, I have not figured out how to run that far. I do so many other things, good stamina, but anyway, that's for I guess another podcast. So
Sure thing.
one of the ways that we want to make this soup more delicious, more accommodating for students, has been this notion of let's break down silos in higher ed. Let's change the way we do things, and one of many ways is this concept of student success teams. And you have done a lot of work to learn what is that exactly, because it doesn't mean the same thing at every campus. You created a guide, a student success teams guide, and please take us through the process of creating that guide and what are the findings.
Yeah. And I'm so glad we get to talk about it, where I'm incredibly proud of this work. And I want to acknowledge my phase two colleague, Suzanne Lyons, who co-authored the guide with me and has been just a fantastic partner. So the guide itself is about holistic student support teams, which is sort of an evolving and new structure to provide students with holistic support on community college campuses. And before I talk about the guide, I'll just really back up quickly and give you sort of the research base for this, which is, for many, many years, going back, long before I left CCRC and founded phase two, I was doing all of this work on what students need outside of the classroom to be successful learners in the classroom. And the field has really evolved, and to the point where we understand that you have to support students as their whole selves if they're going to navigate institutions and be successful learners. And so what happens outside of the classroom is important for what happens inside the classroom. That's not merely academic advising and planning. It includes helping students navigate basic needs. It includes helping them learn how to be college students as we culturally expect them to. And that's not how our colleges are set up, right? So our colleges were set up for a very long time to have these very, very siloed, not just student services versus academic support, right? But like financial aid was in one office and advising was in a different building. And if you had a food pantry, it was down in the basement. And so students were being asked to navigate all of these services if they wanted to meet all of their needs as full humans and learners. The puzzle has been, we know, and we know this from research, we know this from the CUNY ASAP work in New York, we know this, that task force from IES that you mentioned, we synthesized all of the rigorous research on advising and student support. And it's very clear that if you can create this holistic structure for students where they have a person, they have sustained support that's not just about the first year, but all the way through, they're much more likely to be successful. The challenge has been, how do you do that on our campuses, which are immensely resource constrained? We don't have enough advisors and counselors. We don't know how to reach students where they are because we're all doing effectively like 7 jobs on many campuses. And the needs are vast and the resources are not. And so that's really been the puzzle that I've been working in for a while, is how do you do what we know works in a way that is scaled and we can get to as many students as possible. And again, we have done this for pockets of students for years. We have done it in Puente, Trio, Umoja, our foster youth programs, CUNY ASAP. The problem is it's 2 or 4 or 600 students on campuses of thousands of students. And so again, the puzzle was, how do you take those research-based principles of holistic support and scale them and not lose the magic of focusing on equity populations and being culturally responsive, but scaling? So that was sort of what we were trying to figure out. A lot of colleges, their solution to this puzzle has been to launch what are called student success teams. And at a very high level, that was, if you can't hire more advisors and counselors, let's have a team of people do holistic support as a way to be almost an efficiency play when you scale. So we set out to understand from the early adopters of this approach, like, how do you do that? And as you said, Al, when you go to a team approach, you're inherently breaking boundaries. You're inherently thinking in different ways cross-functionally, and we know that the work is really hard. And so what we wanted to do was understand how leading edge institutions are implementing these student success teams. We went into the guide really committed to using the principles of rigorous qualitative research, but doing it in a way that was incredibly actionable for practitioners. So the guide itself is based on 85 interviews at 9 institutions, 6 of them in California, 3 from other states that are analogous, strong collective bargaining cultures, et cetera. So 85 folks. We coded everything 3 times. We did what I would have done at CCRC, but then rather than write a journal article, we were trying to pull out the nuggets of lessons for practitioners. And so everything that's in there is grounded in research principles. I feel confident that it's a thing. It's beyond anecdote, but it's not highfalutin, like qualitative theory the way I might have done 10 years ago. We also worked directly with the designer and a design team from the outset so that we could make a guide that was accessible to people who don't work in higher ed. They really pushed us to think about our language and to be really actionable. The idea is that if you are on a college campus and you're like playing with a success team idea, you can pull this guide off the shelf and start to think about, what do I need to do to make it happen, right? What have other colleges done? And importantly, we really wanted to elevate how hard the work was. We heard a lot from folks that we're done with bright, shiny objects. We want to understand essentially where things go south. And so the guide is actually structured around the kinds of things you need to think about from the beginning, because if you don't, it will make the work harder. So it's almost like, here's what the early adopters wish they'd done differently. And here are the tactics they used to get unstuck when things got sometimes a little ugly. And that way you, as a practitioner, can learn from these 85 folks. If I plan for this, here are some strategies I can use that hopefully will smooth things. I'm not going to pretend it's going to suddenly be easy, because that's not what I believe. But it's really practical and tactical. So that was the guide itself. And I'm really excited to hear from folks if we achieve those goals, because we tried really hard to like I said, be evidence-based, but in a way that is useful for people actually doing the work.
And I appreciate that you went the route of having the practitioner in mind. I've been saying this for years. I get it that in higher ed, especially when you're at a university, you gotta, publish or perish, and you gotta go submit to journals and all that. And then fellow researchers can read that. That's great. But I work with practitioners I have for decades. They don't read those articles. They'll look at the abstract and maybe the findings, but they're not going to spend a ton of time or no time at all on the methodology and all of that. And so I've even told all my researcher friends, if you're going to publish something in a journal article, can then you create that as some slides or visuals for the practitioner? So I appreciate that you went this route. So what are some of the findings?
Yeah. So the first finding was that, as you know, Al, we have a language problem in higher education. So we thought that we would be looking at these student success teams, and it was a thing. And I should say, we pulled together an advisory board of practitioners, and I am so grateful to them. We had folks from campuses and community colleges in California and across the country. We had some folks from the chancellor's office. We had some nonprofit folks helping guide us around the methodology and making sure that we were again foregrounding what practitioners needed to know from our data. So we pulled together a definition of student success teams that essentially says it is a team of people cross-functionally working together to cohort manage a group of students from entry to completion, meaning you're not doing full case management, but you're keeping an eye on that cohort to provide holistic student support. And so right there, we were already differentiating it from some campuses have success teams that are institution-wide, right? And they're really looking at data and looking at, as a campus or as a college, where do we need to double down? And so we were already differentiating it from that kind of student success team. But these are success teams that are meant to provide holistic student support to cohorts of students. And we and our advisory board thought that would be a sufficient definition. And that's how we selected our 9 colleges. And what we realized was even within that definition, there are essentially 3 kinds of holistic student support teams. So, we really make life complicated for ourselves in higher ed. And what's interesting about that is I think of it from a change management perspective. And I think what we think is happening is the 3 sort of flavors of teams actually are sort of an evolution or a continuum. So colleges seem to be starting with what we're calling sort of this back-end coordinating team, where a group of cross-functional folks are working almost behind the scenes to start looking at data to coordinate services for their cohort. And I want to be clear that this isn't about the whole institution. It's still about, often it's a meta major, but not always. But you've got multiple teams on a campus. We're going to look at our data and we're going to figure out where the trouble comes for our arts and humanities students, or we're going to figure out what additional supports we need to get our engineering students over the finish line. So they're cohort managing it. But what's interesting about this team is the students often don't know it exists. Like the folks on the team are keeping an eye on the cohort, but the students may not know it's happening on their behalf because it's back end. And I think what we've come to realize is that that's step one, because you do need a data infrastructure to do this work, right? And so these teams are sort of the first step towards building that infrastructure where you could do more intensive student-facing case management. The second type of team is what we call network support. And I'd say that this is what I think is most common in California right now in particular, where you've got a group of people who work as a team, and they're like all maybe named in the student's LMS as their team. And they're an easily identifiable network of people for a student. So if I'm a student, I know that this is my counselor or advisor. I know this is my faculty liaison. Maybe I know this is my financial aid person. And they're all named for me, but at least I know who to go to. And those folks work together to coordinate support for the students on their team. And they try and streamline, they integrate, and they often continue to do those back-end coordinating data exploration things as well. So that's why I say we're sort of seeing that they build on one another and they're not a stage theory. They overlap sometimes too. The final kind of team we identified, and I would argue that this is the most mature kind of team and the closest I've seen to doing a like CUNY ASAP case management without having to do CUNY ASAP case management, because we know that you can't really afford that in most places, is what we're calling a networked single point of contact. And so in that instance, you do name for the students one advisor or counselor who's like their go-to person. That advisor or counselor is not alone. It's not full case management. They have a named group of folks behind them. So they have an assigned financial aid coordinator, an assigned faculty partner who they can do warm handoffs with. If they can't answer a student's question, they can go to that person. So on the back end, it still is like this network, this team supporting the cohort. But for a student, it's like, Al, you're my person. And Al, if you can't answer my question, you have a whole team to help me. So this really is evolutionary in that you kind of can't do that network single point of contact if you haven't figured out your data and you haven't figured out who the network is. It's really hard to get to that single point of contact. But they are distinct. When you look at them, they are different kinds of teams. And we did not expect that. I mean, we really thought a team is a team is a team. And that was not at all what we were finding.
What I found over the years, because I've asked a lot of questions as I've seen student success teams, so many campuses trying it, they show me PowerPoint slides. They're very pretty with a team for each meta major. But when I ask them, what do you do? What do you actually do? They'll say, well, we do cohort or case management. I said, but what's your definition of that?
Mm-hmm.
And they don't have one.
Yeah.
When I dig and dig and dig, the theme that emerged for me, at least for campuses that were doing this in their first or second year, is that they're forming these teams, but they were primarily a referral service.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, we see a particular milestone here. These students are not taking 30 units in their first year. So we're going to refer them to Puente or Umoja so it's primarily a referral type of situation.
Mm-hmm.
What have you found is a consistent definition of case management or cohort management that moves beyond just, I'm going to send you an email or a text,
Yep.
and I'm going to have you go to this other department?
Yeah, so I think this is again sort of an evolutionary thing. I mean, we heard a lot of that too, Al, that one of the things we realized, and I hope this comes through in the guide, is that it would behoove institutions newer to this work to have a conversation about what case management or cohort case management is before you launch the team. I think a lot of folks, because this work is so urgent, and for that, I am grateful, right? There was a time where nobody paid attention to holistic student support. So I'm grateful that folks have urgency and just want to move. But because the work is so urgent, a lot of institutions launched their teams without really digging into what's the team going to do? And this is something that, you and I have talked about this, and I feel like a bit like a broken record, but I'll say it anytime I can. This is true with lots of reforms. We tend to focus on the structural change. How will we rearrange the deck chairs? Not what we're going to do differently once we have a new structure. And I think it impedes our ability to actually change the student experience, which is what we care about, right? So I think you're right. I think a lot of colleges launched success teams because it was urgent without spending time figuring out, like, what are we going to do? And so we have actually talked about in the guide that it behooves a college to spend a little bit more time in the planning phase, starting to articulate what will you do? What does case management mean? Define what equity means, because these are only equity strategies if you center your definition of what that looks like and how you measure it throughout the process. You can't just say we're going to do success teams for equity. You got to actually do that, right? So all of these difficult definitional conversations really need to come before you launch. And I think what you're reacting to, Al, is because colleges were being urgent, you're seeing a lot of institutions that launch the structure without the conversation about what do we do with the structure. And again, that's not a success team thing only. I think we do that a lot in higher ed. I will say that if you double down on what does cohort case management look like, first of all, I would argue the referral service, that a student knows how to find the referral service, is still better than what was before. So let's not discount that, right? If we think of this as an evolution, if we think of transformation of our institutions as one long continuous improvement process, which is how I like to think of it, even that referral service is better than what was before. It may not be our perfect end state, but I'll take it over letting atomized students just wander around hoping they find the right person, right? And I really do think that there is something that we need to acknowledge, that this work is hard, it is long term. We at a college talk in this study, it's my new favorite thing, about how they launched their first pancake. That, you know, when you make pancakes, like the first one, like the griddle's never quite right. It's like saying you just made a sad thing. Like it's never quite the right temperature. It's always a little burned or a little misshapen. And then you got to tweak it to get the good pancakes. And they talked about how their first foray into success teams, they're like, it was our first pancake. Like it was not really where we wanted to go, but it was better than nothing. And so I want to just acknowledge that the colleges that you're referring to that haven't dug into cohort case management, it's probably still better than what was. That said, I think ultimately where you want to get to is a place where if you have a cohort, whether it's a meta major, or we had a couple of colleges in our study that were doing their success teams around affinity groups. So either for all of their Black students or through their multicultural center. So it doesn't have to be through a meta major. But whoever your cohorts are, you're looking at the data partly on the back end so that you can coordinate things, streamline, fix policies, do referrals, but also get to a place where you can do that proactive outreach to say, these are the students in our caseload who something's like not right, something's off. Let's figure out how we talk about you, Al, as a student, not our global cohort, and intervene with them. And at the same time, you're building relationships with those students so they will come to you. One of the things that's super powerful about this network single point of contact is by having only a single point of contact who is responsible for those initial outreaches and get to know you conversations, the students come back to that person because now they know their advisor or their counselor. And, you know, the college that had the most mature version of this in our study called them success advocates. And we interviewed those success advocates. They said, our jobs are so much richer than they were before because the students come to us, you know, and that to me is this cohort case management. It doesn't mean every student in the cohort was coming to them all the time, but the ones who needed it were, right? And I think that's where you ultimately want to get to, is this dance between analyzing the cohort data to do some higher level interventions for everyone or large groups of students in the cohort, individual data analysis to do proactive outreach, and then the time and space, because you have a team approach, to get to know your students so they will come to you.
Yes, thank you. Work with colleges, I tell them about the 3 C's. I say clarity, coherence, and consensus. Relentless clarity, because you're right. If the referral system is better than nothing, but when they lack the clarity, for example, when they have a robust FYE program that's also doing a referral service,
Right.
and now students are being, and then they're also part of TRIO, and so now they're receiving double
Mm-hmm.
the contact. So that relentless clarity is so important to actually define what does it mean to cohort and case management and evolve, right? This is messy work. It is that first pancake can look pretty interesting.
Exactly.
The other thing that I've noticed, let me know if you have as well, is that it's very interesting. I noticed that rural colleges, right, they may be small, but the people have such limited capacity because they're required to do more
Yes.
because there are small campus, right? Then you have the other extreme. I work with campuses that have 30, 40, 50,000
Mhm.
students, and they experience something similar. You would think they do have more funding, obviously more resources to some extent, but they're overstretched. And it seems like, and it depends on leadership. We'll get on leadership here in a moment. Almost the sweet spot appears to be the midsize that can pull this off. Not to say that rural college cannot or huge
Mm-hmm.
one, but especially the single contact for 30, 40, 50,000 student population college is extremely challenging to
Yeah.
say the least. Have you found any themes on small size, mid size, large size as it relates to student success team development and implementation
Yeah,
by
I'm
any chance?
sitting with that a little bit. And I think you're onto something. I don't think our colleges would totally support that. I'm sitting with it. Our rural colleges for sure. I mean, everyone, it's really hard. The flip side of that though is that you have fewer people to go back to the culture change conversation, right? You have fewer people to convince. And I do think that some of these really large institutions, and this is true both in the 9 colleges in the guide and some other colleges we work with at phase 2, there are just so many more people. It's like moving the Titanic in a big institution. It's just the communication is harder. There are way many more opportunities for people to get the wrong information or interpret it incorrectly. You've got to convince that many more hearts and minds. And so that is really hard at these large institutions. I had a VP say, it's like trying to move the Titanic here. Like I can get 20 people on board, but there are still 30 who have no idea what's happening. Whereas at a small institution, at least those communication channels are there. And I actually have found that in small institutions, from a workload perspective, it's hard. I do think this notion of everybody knows you and you have a single point of contact is a little easier in the smaller institutions because they kind of all know each other anyway, because there just aren't as many people. The mid-sized institutions, I think it really depends. And that's what I'm really sitting with. I'm trying to figure out if there is a sweet spot. And I would say that none of the schools with whom we work would tell you this work was easy or simple, even
Sure,
if
it
it
never is.
does. It never is.
It never is. I'm just wondering from your perspective, because you work with small size, mid size, and
Mhm.
large. It's not scientific by any
Yeah.
uh, right, but it's just a theme that I have found because of capacity issues. They're just
Mhm.
different capacity issues with a very small and a very large. The mid size, yeah, but ultimately, so much of this is about leadership, right? What can you tell us a little bit about the importance of leadership
Oh
in
gosh. So
success teamwork?
I could talk about it for forever. And I think, one of the things that this guide and this study were about the launch of student success teams, but I went into it. I mean, my long-term interest is about transformation more broadly. I mean, my love is always going to be holistic student supports. That's what my research agenda was at CCRC. It's about students as humans. And so I love that piece of the work. But for me, this is always about institutional transformation. And so the success teams are an example of that. And so I think a lot of what we learned is relevant for all kinds of transformations. And leadership was it's so critical and complicated. And I'm really reflecting on the article we're recording this the day after that article in Inside Higher Ed came out about the unbelievable leadership churn in the California community college system, which of course I think most of us know intuitively, but it was sort of dug into and quantified. And I think because 6 of our 9 institutions were in California, we did see a fair amount of what happens with the churn when you try and do this work. Really, what it comes down to is this really interesting tension, I think, between leading from the middle and needing senior level support. So we talk a lot in higher ed about middle level leadership, about distributed leadership, and much of this transformational work, student success teams, guided pathways, has been, I don't want to use the word delegated, but has really been asked to be done by middle level leaders. That's awesome because it builds skill sets. Middle level leaders are closer to the day to day often than senior leaders. It's a pipeline, which clearly we need. But there are different ways to do this delegating to middle level leaders that can enhance or inhibit the work. And that's what really came out in our conversations. And we hear this a lot. And it goes back years ago when I was at CCRC, we did a study looking at transformation where we basically realized that to do big transformation, and this was a study of advising redesign using technology, you need what we call sort of an aligned leadership. You needed to have middle and senior level leaders on the same page, running in the same direction, talking the same talk, but using their positionality in complementary ways. It wasn't enough in that study to have fabulous senior level leaders who didn't have middle level support, nor was it enough to have fabulous middle level leaders in absence of the senior support. And really, this study on success teams confirmed that. The flavor of middle level leadership matters so very much. And I think what was most poignant for me was, and this is partly because we were analyzing this with practitioners in mind, I didn't want to confirm that. I want to know, like, what does that really mean? What do senior leaders do to empower a middle level leader? Right? We hear all the time, you got to empower them, you got to support them. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like? And so we really dig into the guide into the kinds of things senior leaders need to do to truly let the middle level leaders grow and shine. And it was really poignant. You know, we had one middle level leader say to us at one point, he's like, the bottom line is, like, at some point, leaders got to lead. Like, I can only do so much from where I sit. At some point, I need my senior leadership to step up and make some choices. And I thought it was really poignant because I do think a lot, you know, middle level leaders are so powerful and yet they're not, they're constrained. And there are times where senior leaders can err on the side of being quote unquote distributed. And all it does is lead to frustration. And we had a couple examples of that too. So we learned a ton, and we do have in the guide a couple of like pages of this is what people actually did to support their middle level leaders. So for senior leaders, it's something you can take away. And for middle level leaders, I want to be clear, we have the same kind of page for middle level leaders too. What does it really look like to lead from the middle?
Yeah, I find it really interesting how there's so much alignment with the research in area of project management.
Mm-hmm.
And it's classic that project managers are tasked with two things: go make change, but you have no authority.
Exactly.
And so that's what's happened with the guided pathways work in general, is that there are so many of these presidents, vice presidents say, well, I need to step out. I can't really be involved because, it gives the idea here, the perception that I'm, it's top down.
Mm-hmm.
But let's have faculty guided pathways coordinators, and these poor people, they have to actually enact change, but have no authority to
Right.
do it. So they have to use the art of persuasion, do things that may not require upper leadership to say, I approve. But when the upper leadership is missing in action, it really makes it difficult, right? And then on top of that, I don't know if you heard of my 3-month rule.
Oh yeah,
That
I can say your 3-month rule all the time, Al. I think I might have mentioned it in a meeting this morning.
and you know what? I've kind of reduced it to 2, 3. I use it just because maybe it's more optimistic at times, right? But for the listeners, there's only 2 or 3 months in a year for colleges to get priority work done, right? Summer, forget about it. September, too busy. Start of the semester, October's good. November, December, it's the holidays and it's finals. We're lucky to squeeze in 1 or 2 meetings. January, we're gone. February, it's like September. It's the start of the new semester, too busy. March is okay. April is spring break, and May, are you crazy?
Right, exactly.
So we have, and then on top of everything else, we have a highly dysfunctional committee structure
Mm-hmm.
where people leave the meetings going, oh my gosh, that was the biggest waste of time. They have no sense of outcomes, what the work is. They'll go from one meeting talking about something, and then they go to the next meeting, and the first half of that meeting is exactly what they were talking about in the other meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And this lack of clarity, right back to the 3 C's. And so what happens is, as you know, you get people that say things in meetings. 1 or 2 faculty will say something, and then everybody leaves the meeting and goes, well, faculty now don't want to do this, as if those 2 faculty represent all of faculty. Same thing with administrators. Well, the dean said this in this meeting. Well, administration, one dean is supposed to right, represent all. So all I'm saying is that everything that you mentioned and the challenges of leadership, but we have so much, Harriet has so many hurdles.
Mhm.
And these poor people, these leaders from the middle, are tasked with making change, culture change, but again, with no authority. So what are some of the tips that you have in the guide for leaders, for middle managers, and vice versa?
Yeah. So, I mean, and I should also say we're going to hopefully dig into this a little bit more. One of the things we're really grateful for is our funder, College Futures. We were like, listen, we have 85 interviews, and our advisory board was clear that practitioners want no more than 25 pages to read. So we can't give you all the details. And they were really grateful and are gracious and are giving us additional funding to build out additional products. So over the next couple months, we'll be rolling out sort of deeper dives into some of the topics that came up in the guide, including leadership. And we'll also be doing some videos with middle level leaders around how they navigated pieces of the work. So this is just, sort of the first step. And I want to, first of all, thank the foundation, but also just let folks know there's more coming. One of the things that we heard, and you sort of alluded to this, is, and it was another one of those times where our interviewees just said it better than we ever could have, which is top down does not mean bottom only. And I think that is so critical, especially to your point, things like student success teams, because they are cross-functional. And I'm not talking about just crossing academic and student services. We're talking about data, technology, the registrar, to get these back-end teams up and running. That infrastructure requires talking to communications and your IR people and your IT people. A middle level leader doesn't have the authority to tell the registrar you need to start coding a student's meta major, right? And yet somehow they're supposed to do that. So top down does not mean bottom only. There are times when senior leaders need to step in and use the power that they have, the authority they have to get things done. The other thing that was really important, I think, for senior level leaders, and you alluded to this too, Al, was being clear about the vision and the constraints. So there is this sense of when you start in the design and early implementation phase, we want to let the middle level leaders design the thing. We want this to come from the ground up. But often senior level leaders, A, have a picture in their brain of what it should be, and B, know what's not possible because of resource constraints that middle level leaders can't possibly know. And so we actually had one college in our sample, and it was really heartbreaking in that they had been given full authority to design a student success team, and they designed what they called the Cadillac model, only to go back to senior level leadership and be told, like, well, actually, we wanted like the fiat. You can't do what you want. The middle level leaders really interpreted that. They took it a little personally, but also interpreted it as it made them question their faith in the senior level leaders a little bit about, does our college really believe in this work? Do they believe in this? Why am I putting my effort in, my heart and my soul? And it really set their work back, even though they then had the other version, which again was not a bad version, but it wasn't what they had been empowered to design, and it felt really awful. So I would say one of the other key things for senior leaders is to set that vision, to sort of get those definitions, that clarity of what's supposed to be accomplished, what the constraints are. Like if there are things that aren't on the table, like honestly, this is the New Yorker to me. Like just call it, you know, set it out there. Better to upset people at the beginning than at the end. From a middle level, there are other things too, obviously, but those are two. And then from a middle level leader, I think, some of this is a learning process, but we need mid-level leaders to, and this is partly because I love mid-level leaders and believe in you, but to really set the stage for, you are the experts in this work. Especially if you're on counseling faculty and this is a holistic student support redesign, like things. And it's okay to say this won't work or this will work for our job function. So to be in the room and use your voice at the table to grasp that power is really critical. And the flip side of that, I think, and I don't think we talk about this enough, we talk a lot about that relationship between senior and mid-level leaders, but there are frontline staff too who are going to be directly implicated in any of these reforms. And we don't talk about them enough. And I think mid-level leaders have a really critical role to play in working with frontline staff to help them get engaged and get their voice heard in design and implementation and deal with the big feelings that big changes rightly engender. So to start to anticipate, like, this is going to like not work for whomever, or this is going to be hard, we need to plan for it. That is a critical role for folks in the middle, because you see up, but you also see, I don't want to use down, but if it's a hierarchical structure, you see down. And that's a space that vantage point is critical.
I try to engage colleges with something thought provoking. I may start a project with them with a few quotes. And over the years, I've been fortunate. I've been able to work with so many. So one of the things I'll have up, I'll say, I tell them they already know. I would have told them about the 3-month rule and all of that stuff. But as you know, as colleges begin the work, they tend to lose momentum. It's just the nature of the work. But the way I often explain it, I say, colleges lose critical initiative momentum when leaders neglect to behave like teachers
Mm.
and faculty neglect to behave like leaders. And I
Yeah.
let them sit with that
Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
while. Like, what does that actually mean? And what I'm trying to get at is that leaders forget that people who are in a VP president role, you're still a teacher.
Mhm.
You still, right? You have to put on your teaching hat. You have to give everybody that relentless clarity, well, not just vision, but use some tools. I'm going back to project management because I'm big on that. Get the team to put together a logic model, for goodness sakes. Let's all be on the same page of your outcomes, your activities, your outputs, and then create an action plan. And then faculty, don't forget that you're leaders,
Yeah.
that you can coach up.
Hmm.
Uh, and then the other quote that I mentioned because of, and I usually use this with presidents and VPs and to some extent deans, because they say, "Oh, Al, this has to be totally organic. These teams work. I can't be there at all. Just have to be away. This has to be organic." What I've come up over the years, I say, well, look, allowing organic processes within teams is fine, but without some measure of structure and guidance, teams inevitably become organically lost.
Hmm. Or what they do, Al, and this is something I have seen, and we talk about a lot, not really in the guide as much as just some of the work that we do at Phase 2. You end up in a place, if it's so organic, if the whole point is to make sure that all students get a base level of support, which is not the case right now on most campuses. If you let your teams kind of do whatever they want and go rogue, you're going to wake up in a year or two and you're going to have one student success team that's throwing parties for their meta major and one student success team that's doing holistic student support. You're laughing, but I have been at that college. Okay.
I'm laughing because I know I've seen it.
And that is not the intent. The intent is to make sure that all students at your college get what they need when they need it, and not all of them need balloons. So, what we tend to counsel is, as you build out your student success teams, whatever flavor of team that is, you need to have a base like template or structure. Like, here are the things that all of your student success teams need to do. And this is the base level of outreach. Like, every success team is going to send a welcome email, they're going to send a welcome back email, whatever it is. And this is, again, why we really tend to counsel going slow to go fast. Spend a fair amount of time in the implementation design before you try and launch so that your first pancake's at least edible. But you need sort of that base structure, and then you need some organic involvement within that, right? Because if you're doing this in meta majors, what your health students need is going to be different than what your arts and sciences transfer students need. There's this whole set of things for your health students who don't get into competitive programs that needs to be built organically by that team, right? But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be an expectation that, for example, every success team, we've seen a lot of colleges use the LMS actually to do a lot of their cohort case management. So you almost build like a course shell for each meta major. And so there's a base expectation that every success team will use the LMS and include such and such information and send such and such emails, right? And then you can tailor it. But if you don't have the base level structure, organic just recreates a new but similar mess to what we were trying to solve.
Exactly. Yeah, the best thing to do is, I tell them, look, if you're going to do the cohort management or case management, what are your 4 or 5 goals that you want to achieve with students, right? Do you want to, and by the way, a meta major can have upwards of 4 or 5 thousand students,
Mhm.
and you have a team of 4 or 5. So if one of your goals is, for example, we want to ensure that all students in our meta major have an updated comprehensive ed plan, we have to have the technology to first be able to flag, know who they are. And this is where we get about the equity. Then if we're dealing with 4 or 5 thousand students, let's disaggregate that and which are our DI populations that are really right. So now we are much more targeted. But yeah, that's funny, Melinda. I was laughing because I've seen that because we allowed them to be too organic in the beginning
Yep.
without a lot of structure and planning, you have that.
And this is exactly why we wanted to flag in the guide the things to get ahead of, right? So, I laugh about it, but the reality is we're talking about the early adopters. And
Right.
whenever you do something new, you're going to do things that in retrospect didn't make a ton of sense, but we didn't know that. So now that we do, the intent is to say, okay, heads up, this sounded like a good idea, but actually here's an alternative way to approach it, right? We've learned from the pioneers. And so I want to be clear that it sounds really funny, and it is much harder to clean that up, that situation, than to start at the beginning with a little bit more structure. And throughout the guide, we do those kinds of surfacing of areas that, in retrospect, we could have done it differently. And to be fair to the institutions in our guide, like, they problem solved their way through it.
Mhm.
It made it harder than it had to be, and we don't want others to repeat that. We want everyone to make new mistakes. Let's put it that way. Let's not make the same ones others did. Make your own. But we really do think that spending time, to your point about getting clear, what do you want your teams to do? What do you need in order for them to do that? Right? And how will you accomplish it? That needs to be done before you ever launch. Now, I'll say that one of the other things is that is iterative. You may think you need X. Once you launch, you realize you need X prime. That's okay. But you need to at least start from a place where you know you're going to do the following things. The other one that we talk a lot about in that regard, data and technology feel obvious, but the other one is people. And we don't need to go into that because I know we're probably brushing up on time, but I did want to put that out there that this is people change, right? You're
Mhm.
asking people not just during the planning phase, but once you launch, you're asking people to do their jobs differently. And that brings up all sorts of stuff. Some of it logistic, just what do those jobs look like? How do you navigate collective bargaining agreements, et cetera? But some of it is full on emotional and identity work. And some of it is professional learning. And so I think one of the big insights for us was, once you start to clarify what does cohort case management mean for us, what are our expectations, you also need to put a plan in place to support people to meet those expectations. If you say that now that we know that part of your job is going to be going into the Canvas shell and identifying which students don't have a program plan and reaching out to them in an equity forward way, I don't know, that's not what you were hired to do necessarily. And so we better support you as a professional with learning opportunities to navigate that technology, rethink how you work with students who don't have a plan and why not. It used to be that was like the thing that career services did, but maybe you need a little bit of light touch career development, professional learning. So building professional learning plans into implementation is a really critical change management piece that I think we haven't fully evolved. We spend a lot of time on professional learning for case making. We spent less time thinking about how to support our faculty, staff in doing the new jobs in a strategic, thoughtful, and sustained way. And I do think that one of the reasons we often get a lot of resistance to big change is because it's fear. I don't know how to do this. You're asking me to do something I don't know how to do.
Oh, it's definitely almost always rooted in fear, and that's why I get back to why leadership is so important in this, because I've seen this time and time again. and it's not just student success teams, it's, we need to change our practices. We need to be more equitable. And then you go to a certain committee, because they'll do a roadshow and there needs to be, go through committee meetings. And then I'm kind of tired of this word, to be honest with you, because of the way it's being used. I have concerns. I have some concerns. Some of them are genuine, but it's just a delay sabotage tactic. And when it's done within the context of a committee, then again, the 2 or 3 month rule, then without leadership stepping in, they don't have to be front and center, but they got to be chess players doing things behind the scenes, because it's often just a few that have fear, and then they drive the agenda for the rest of the campus.
Yeah. Right.
And we see this time and time and time again.
Yeah. And so if you can mitigate some of those concerns by saying, well, we actually have a plan to help
That's
you
right.
over those concerns, I think that goes a long way. And I don't think we saw a couple examples of it in our study of colleges that were really digging into sustained professional learning, like every week, an hour, as part of their team meeting. Which sounds crazy given how busy people are. And of course, they threw it to the side during like peak registration periods, let's be honest. But the idea that our norm is we are all learners all the time, and we're going to do this together, and we're going to support each other, and there is an opportunity to do your job better. That was really powerful. The other thing that you alluded to was this idea that at some point, senior leadership needs to come back in and say, we're just going to try it. I know you have concerns, and maybe it won't work, and then we'll come back. And I say this with, obviously you have to respect governance and you have to respect bargaining, but to sort of say as a leader, like, we've done our due diligence. We know we need to make the change. This is the direction we're committed to. Come with me on this journey. Let's try it. And being brave enough as a senior leader to say, we've tried to mitigate as much as we can. I hear your concern. Come with me and make the call. Again, when that happened, first of all, middle level leaders were so appreciative. But secondly, that's how you move things, because otherwise you can concern yourself to never changing, and that doesn't serve our students.
Exactly. Ultimately, the end outcome is student success and equity. And I talk about that in between. There's something that has to happen in between. And that's that attitudes and behaviors need to change, but you're not going to get to that if you don't do the work.
Exactly.
You got to do the work. You got to stop planning to plan and discuss. There's a time for that. It's so important to have that, but it just drags on for years. And then you just see pockets of success here or there, and you don't see the kinds of changes we need to the culture, to practices, to really move the needle. This was so informative, Melinda. I want to thank you so much for doing this study. Obviously, I'm going to put it in the show notes, a link to it.
Thanks.
What else do you have in store down the pipeline here? You have any more products, if you will, that you would like to share?
Yeah, so we're in the middle of, as I mentioned, College Futures is incredibly generous. And so we'll be rolling out, so we're filming this in April. Between now and basically back to school, every other month we'll be coming out with deeper dives. Our hope is to get out sort of a getting started set of resources at the end of April, sort of digging into those types of teams that probably made people's eyes glaze over when I shared them at the beginning. Some questions to ask yourself, and some sort of day in the life, like, what does it really look like if I pick this team or that team? Because one of the things we really want is folks to be thoughtful about, if they say, we're going to do student success teams, to your point, what does that mean? How would you know which team? So those should be coming out in the next month or so, along with hopefully some videos of practitioners. And then we'll release a few more sort of towards the end of June. We'll be looking at professional learning. We're looking at equity, because we spent a fair amount of time digging into how colleges intentionally use the teams as an equity strategy, or in some cases not. So we'll put out a couple more resources in June, a couple more for back to school. All of that is on its own special page on Phase 2's website. And then in addition, of course, Phase 2 Advisory keeps working with colleges and foundations on holistic student support, on advising redesign. I'm super excited. I'll be at the California Guided Pathways Institute at the end of April. I told Rob I may just burst into tears to be back in community with with all of our practitioners and getting back to doing the work in a new way. So we have a bunch of stuff coming out. But the thing that I'm most proud of right now, and am always happy to get feedback from folks, is the idea that we're putting out these practitioner products that, again, they're not anecdote, they're data, but they're designed for the folks, as you say, Al, doing the work.
I may see you there in late April. I'm going to go crash it for a moment. I'm still so busy. Still, I have commitments with colleges throughout the whole. Since I haven't traveled, as you
Yep.
experienced, I'm serving. I'm really fortunate to help a lot more colleges because it's all virtual. But I'm going to drop by
Yay.
and crash for a little bit. The last thing I'd like to close, because you're a marathoner. And I like for you to close us out with, metaphorically speaking, given your experience as a marathoner and the challenges but rewards that go with that, how would you use that experience to explain what you've learned with the student success team work?
So I had a feeling you might ask that. So I was thinking about it. And I actually realized I ran most of my marathons in grad school. I've run a couple since then, but most of them were in grad school. And I think it's because, when you're in grad school, it's like a slog. You never graduate. It's not even, you don't even get the end of the semester eventually. Like there are no milestones in grad school. And a marathon is very rigid. Like to train for a marathon, it's 18, 26 weeks. You know what you have to do every day. You get to check it off, which for those of us who are goal oriented is wonderful. Maybe you only wrote one paragraph of your dissertation that day, but at least you went for your long run. And it's very tactical. And so I do think there's a lesson there for all of this, not just student success teams, but this transformational work, which is, yes, you need to keep your eye on the big picture, which maybe is that marathon, but there are intermediate things to do and celebrate on the way. And that's really important. And it comes back to this idea of, you don't need to have the perfect student success team from the get-go. Maybe all you can do right now is get that back-end team up and running. I'm okay with that because it's better than where you were. And maybe in a year, you'll have more capacity and you can move to the next phase, right? You don't have to write the dissertation overnight. You can be working on that slowly while you figure out how to run a marathon. It's weird to make the marathon the thing that's shorter, but it actually is in my world, or was. But I think that idea of spelling out where you want to go in the long run, but figuring out what those intermediate places are that are better than before is really important for all of this work, because we can go down a paralyzing rabbit hole of, we are never going to fix our institutions. So why try? Just data navel gaze, problem solve, identify the challenges. At some point, you just got to put one foot in front of the other, and it will be better is the thing. Because I think, everyone who does this work cares about students. So as you say, I'll do the work, check that little run off, and eventually you'll wake up and realize you can run 13 or 26 miles, but no more marathons for me. I'm done. Takes too long.
That was great. Thank you so much for participating in the Student Success Podcast, and go Big Red.
Go Big Red.
Thank you for listening to the Student Success Podcast. Each episode has show notes, which include helpful links and necessary follow-up information to help you get results. Please consider subscribing to the Continuous Learning Institute website. There are no advertisements. It's simply updates about articles, tools, resources, podcasts, etc., all tailored for you, the practitioner. Thank you.